In the galaxy far, far away, there are countless weapons, each forged in the crucible of conflict and refined across millennia. Blasters and thermal detonators, disruptors, and vibroblades, all tools for destruction in a turbulent universe. But no weapon has ever rivaled the elegance, the symbolism, and the mystic status of the lightsaber. For the Jedi, it was the physical manifestation of discipline, serenity, and the connection between the living force and the wielder's will. For the Sith, it was an instrument of dominance, a weapon not merely to defend, but one to conquer. Yet among all the storied lightsabers of history, one stands apart: the crimson blade carried by Darth Vader, the weapon that, more than any other, became synonymous with fear, tyranny, and the unstoppable martial prowess of a Sith Lord. But to understand Darth Vader's lightsaber fully, we must first understand the young man who built it, not in the darkness of the Death Star, but in the fires of the Clone Wars, a boy whose brilliance with machines and weapons evolved into an obsession, a Jedi Knight who refused to be limited by tradition, even as the Council looked on it with disapproval, a warrior who never believed that the Force alone would save him. This is the story of how Anakin Skywalker's philosophy of the blade survived the fall to the dark, and how Darth Vader's lightsaber became the ultimate expression of that obsession. Long before he ever became Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker was recognized by his fellow Jedi as one of the most naturally gifted warriors the Order had ever seen. But Anakin's brilliance extended far beyond combat. From his early days as Obi-Wan's Padawan, Anakin exhibited an almost supernatural skill with machines and engineering, only that could be explained by the Force. He could reassemble a hyperdrive in hours, fine-tune a pod racer's repulsor lift turbines, and repair droid processors from scraps. This mechanical intuition naturally carried over to his lightsaber construction as well. For many Jedi, assembling a lightsaber was a rite of passage performed only a single time. It was done during their journey to Ilum, but for Anakin, this was only the beginning. Anakin did not see the lightsaber as a static object or an artifact to be revered. He saw it as a work in progress. He saw it as a machine that was to be constantly refined and upgraded to better serve his style. And in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, Anakin went through multiple iterations and experiments with his lightsabers, deducing which power cells he wanted, focusing crystal assemblies, and emitter matrix configurations. Some masters of the Order found this eccentric, others found it disrespectful. The Jedi had always been taught to embrace simplicity and humility, but Anakin believed the weapon must be as dynamic as the warrior that was going to wield it. When Anakin settled on a design for a lightsaber, the blue-sated weapon that he would carry into the Clone Wars, it already bore traces of his personal philosophy. The grip was slightly larger than the standard hilt Jedi weapon, designed to give him greater leverage when applying torque and heavy strikes. The power cell was also calibrated to produce a blade of marginally higher density and cutting efficiency, compensating for the heavier two-handed strikes characteristic of Form 5. But it was not merely technical innovation that set Anakin apart. It was his conviction that mastery of the blade itself could overcome any challenge, a conviction that would one day cost him dearly. And that day would come a lot sooner than he anticipated: the duel with Dooku and the birth of obsession. In the vast torchlit hangar on Geonosis, Anakin Skywalker learned one of the most painful lessons of his life. Facing down Count Dooku, the newly revealed Dark Lord of the Sith, Anakin's aggression and confidence were matched by Dooku's decades of experience and impeccable technique. Dooku was a master of Form 2 Makashi, the dueling form, a style designed precisely to counter and dismantle more kinetic styles like Anakin's, at least at this point where he was still utilizing Xian. It was here, as Anakin charged with his signature power blows, that Dooku demonstrated the price of underestimating refinement and discipline. With a single precise cut, Dooku severed Anakin's arm just below the elbow. The pain to him was blinding, but the true wound was to Anakin's pride and his certainty. In this instant, his resolve that no opponent could ever best him was easily broken. This is where the obsession began, rooted in fear, shame, and the desperate need to be in control. And when the Clone Wars erupted across the stars, Anakin would find countless opportunities to test, refine, and prove the power of his new weapon. As the war progressed and Anakin constructed his second lightsaber, Anakin's weapon would undergo significant refinements. He began to incorporate micro-adjustments to the emitter lens and energy modulation circuits to achieve a blade that was fractionally faster to swing and slightly more resistant to contact than other lightsabers. His chosen combat style, Djem So, evolved in parallel. Djem So was an adaptation of Form 5 characterized by powerful counterattacks and an unrelenting offense. This was a style born of frustration with the defensive Sarisu, the style favored by Obi-Wan. Where Surisu focused on the attrition and control of a duel, Djem So embraced dominance and momentum. In turn, the High Council took note of Anakin's increasingly aggressive tendencies, both in his dueling and in his tactics on the battlefield. Some Jedi whispered that his lightsaber was a symbol of his growing darkness, heavier, more forceful, designed to batter opponents into submission. But Anakin refused to apologize for this approach. To him, the blade was not just a weapon. The blade was proof that skill and willpower could triumph over dogma. Throughout the Clone Wars, members of the Jedi Council expressed concern over Anakin's lightsaber modifications. First, they argued that the longer grip was a liability, more difficult now to control in confined spaces, and potentially susceptible to disarming maneuvers. Second, the enhanced power output and the increased plasma density now posed the risk of overheating the internal components during prolonged duels. Third, and most importantly, they felt that Anakin's approach represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a Jedi. Where most Jedi built their lightsaber to be a reflection of serenity, Anakin had built his as a reflection of power. Where others were content to rely on the Force to guide their blade, Anakin sought to engineer the weapon itself to give him an advantage. These critiques did not do much to dissuade him though. If anything, they all cemented Anakin's belief that the Order was shackled by outdated traditions, and that true mastery demanded innovation, even if it meant breaking the rules. But now came the fall. When Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, much of his past was stripped away. His rank, his name, his place in the Order. But not this conviction, not his belief that the blade was the truest measure of any warrior. The final duel on Mustafar against Obi-Wan left Vader mutilated and broken. The lava scorched his body beyond recognition. His connection to the Force was forever diminished by the agony of cybernetic life support. And yet, this obsession with the lightsaber endured. When he awoke in the med center of Coruscant, encased in the iron lungs and black armor that would become legend, Vader faced the practical problem of arming himself again. According to some accounts, Palpatine provided him with one of his spare lightsabers in order to study, instructing his new apprentice in the construction techniques of the ancient Sith. Although the Emperor didn't really care about lightsabers whatsoever when it came to himself, he preferred a more ritualistic approach in forging weapons, attuning them through darkside incantations, and imbuing them with alchemical processes. But Vader approached this object with the same meticulous pragmatism that had defined his life as a Jedi. He had studied the designs that Palpatine provided, but he also drew on the very lesson from the Clone Wars, from the failures that had cost him his limbs. Even in this moment of transformation, when any other Sith Lord would have seized the opportunity to create a weapon symbolic of their rebirth, Vader was different. He retained many of the core design philosophies from his Jedi lightsaber, because in his mind, those designs were not flawed. He was flawed. The blade had never failed him. And so when Vader constructed his new lightsaber, this time ignited with a synthetic red crystal, it bore a familiar silhouette. The hilt retained a slightly larger grip diameter and a similar emitter matrix assembly. When he presented it to his master, Sidious was not pleased. To the Emperor, Vader's decision was a mark of sentimentality, an inability to sever all ties with his past identity. The Emperor critiqued the weapon, calling it too similar to Anakin Skywalker's. But Vader was unmoved by any of these criticisms. The weapon was not a nostalgic indulgence, it was the most effective design that he knew. He had been reforged into something monstrous, but the blade remained the perfect expression of his skill, his will, and his desire never to be powerless again. To understand why Vader retained so much of Anakin's engineering, it helps to look at the specific components, his hilt grip and its length. The hilt was longer than standard, designed for two-handed power blows and enhanced torque. This length allowed Vader to generate tremendous force despite his prosthetic limbs. The emitter retained a hybrid focusing lens capable of stabilizing the higher density plasma channel that he had favored. This design improved cutting power, especially against armored enemies, but at the cost of increased energy consumption. But one of the most fascinating aspects of Vader's Sith weapon was the inclusion of a secondary focusing crystal. Unlike a dual-phase saber, which changes blade length via telescoping components, Vader's design modulated the phase of the plasma itself. This was a rare feature even for Sith. It allowed Vader though to lengthen or shorten the blade on command, adjusting the reach in real time during a duel. Given the higher power output and the synthetic crystal's instability though, the hilt included reinforced power conduits and additional cooling vents. All of this added in order to prevent meltdown during extensive duels. These choices were not made for aesthetic reasons. Every decision was dictated by function. To Vader, the blade was a means to an end, an expression of dominance over every enemy who would ever stand before him. The blade was forged in the shadow of the Death Star, Another detail often overlooked is where the lightsaber was built. In the earliest months of the Empire's formation, while the galaxy was still reeling from Order 66, construction had now begun on the Death Star. The Emperor was determined to create an ultimate weapon, a monument to the Sith's final victory over the Jedi. In this environment surrounded by engineers, slaves, and Sith loyalists, Vader designed and constructed his saber. It is said that the first activation of the blade took place in the same vector where the super laser was now being assembled. The symbolism was unmistakable. A weapon of personal annihilation forged alongside a weapon of planetary annihilation. And while Sidious was consumed with overseeing this grand project, Vader was equally consumed with perfecting the single instrument that mattered most to him. When Vader presented the completed saber to his master, Sidious voiced disappointment. He had hoped that Vader would embrace Sith tradition fully, crafting a weapon that reflected his birth and form as well as function, a saber that would symbolize the final death of Anakin Skywalker. Instead though, the design retained too many similar contours. The lines were clean, industrial like the Jedi weapons that he had carried in the Clone War. Sidious considered this a mark of Vader's lingering attachment to the past. He accused him of sentimentality. He accused him of weakness. But what Sidious could never understand was that Vader did not cling to the past because he missed who he had been. He clung to the past because it was efficient, effective. The blade worked, and that was all that mattered. When Vader finally confronted Obi-Wan again on board the Death Star, it was not merely a rematch of rivals, it was a confrontation layered with memory, resentment, and unspoken fear. One of the most striking details during this duel is the apparent length of Darth Vader's blade. The plasma channel appears visibly longer than in later encounters, especially when compared to the duel on Bespin. Some may dismiss this as a production inconsistency, but in lore, there is actually an explanation. Vader deliberately extended the blade to keep Obi-Wan at a greater distance on the Death Star. Even after years of honing his skill, Vader remained apprehensive of his former master's prowess. Obi-Wan had defeated him once, and Vader would not risk being drawn into close quarters maneuvers that had cost him everything on Mustafar. By extending the blade length, he created a buffer zone, a space where he could dictate tempo and range. This was the practical expression of the dual crystal assembly, a feature he had incorporated precisely for this kind of tactical advantage. Vader's life support armor posed unique challenges to lightsaber combat. The enhanced strength of his prosthetics, though, allowed him to wield the saber with tremendous force, but the suit's bulk limited mobility and reduced finesse. To compensate, Vader adjusted his style to rely on sweeping, powerful strikes. The longer grip and heavier hilt gave him the leverage needed to maintain pressure without exhausting the suit's servos. This style was often mistaken for clumsy by his enemies, especially Order 66 survivors, but in truth, it was a deliberate adaptation, one that took full advantage of his mechanical strength while conserving energy. Many of the Sith Lords in the Rule of Two before Vader had ultimately turned away from the lightsaber as their primary instrument of power. Plagueis had become obsessed with the manipulation of midichlorians. Darth Sidious preferred intrigue, manipulation, and rituals. But Vader never abandoned the blade. Even after becoming more machine than man, even after immersing himself in the dark side, he retained an unshakable belief that true victory was won in the duel. To Vader, the Force was an ally, but it was the lightsaber that proved supremacy beyond question. No deception, no illusions, only skill and will, measured in inches of plasma. This was not merely a practical choice, it was the final expression of Anakin Skywalker's lifelong obsession. The belief that if he perfected the blade, no one could ever take anything from him again. Throughout the Imperial era, Vader's lightsaber was a source of myth and terror. To the surviving Jedi in exile, it was a reminder that their order had fallen. To the Imperial hierarchy, it was the emblem of the Emperor's enforcer, a red blade that meant death to any who defied the new order. Yet for Vader, the weapon had a more personal meaning. It was the only thing that truly belonged to him. His body was a prison of durasteel and synth skin. His will was bound to the Emperor's command, but the blade was his, crafted by his own hands, tuned to his own specifications. And while Palpatine hoarded holocrons and relics, Vader spent countless hours maintaining and refining his lightsaber. He adjusted power regulators, recalibrated the emitter, and even experimented with different synthetic crystal compositions in order to achieve the precise balance that he preferred. This ritual was quiet, methodical, intimate. It was the last connection of the man that he had once been. The act of building and rebuilding the blade was an echo of Anakin Skywalker's ingenuity, and no matter how much he tried to bury that identity, it refused to die. It's telling to consider how Vader's philosophy of combat stood in contrast to other Sith Lords. To Dooku, it was an extension of aristocratic finesse. His Form 2 style was elegant and precise. To Maul, it was about reveling in the ferocity of Form 7, channeling rage into acrobatics and an overwhelming offense. Vader stands in contrast. He committed himself fully to the lightsaber not out of tradition, but because he believed it was the most honest expression of dominance. Where Sidious prized secrets and contingency orders, Vader placed his faith in the one true skill that he had always trusted, the duel. While there is irony in the fact that Vader is one of the most powerful dark side wielders that have ever existed, he never abandoned his dependence on the lightsaber. Many Sith scholars and chroniclers speculated that the reliance reflected an insecurity, an unconscious admission that he no longer trusted the Force alone to sustain him. But this interpretation ignores a deeper truth, that Anakin Skywalker had never been content with surrendering his fate to mysticism, to the Force. Even as a Jedi, he resented the idea of passive submission to the will of the Force. He believed in shaping his own destiny through action, through mastery of every skill and every tool. In the end, the red blade was not merely a crutch, it was a statement. A declaration that no matter how many times the galaxy tried to break him, he would rise again and again, blade in hand. It was his will to impose. When Luke Skywalker finally confronted Vader on Bespin and again aboard the second Death Star, he faced a weapon honed over decades of war, defeat, and a dark purpose. The duels between father and son were more than battles for survival. They were contests of philosophy. Luke Skywalker's green blade was a symbol of hope. The next generation was rising to challenge the sins of the old. Vader's blade was the culmination of Anakin's obsession, reforged through hate, loss, and regret. Even in their final duel, Vader continued to rely on the lightsaber as the ultimate expression of who he was. And in the end, it was only when Luke cast his own blade aside that he showed Vader a different path, the choice to be something more than a weapon. When we look back at the saga of Darth Vader's lightsaber, it is tempting to focus on the technical specifications alone, and indeed, by every measure, the weapon was a masterpiece. A heavier hilt for leverage and power, enhanced plasma density for cutting armored foes, a dual crystal modulation for variable blade length, reinforced conduits and cooling vents for sustained engagements. It was a superior weapon far ahead of many of its contemporaries, but its true significance lies deeper. For all of the Emperor's criticisms, for all of the Council's warnings, for all of the suffering that Vader endured, the lightsaber was the one thing that never betrayed him. It was the tool he relied on to carve his own path through the galaxy, to defend himself against Jedi, to enforce his master's will, and to confront the ghosts of his past. And perhaps most telling of all, it was the single artifact that he never truly let go of. Even as he fell to the dark side, even as he embraced the mantle of a Sith Lord, Vader never abandoned the one lesson that had driven him since that day that Dooku severed his arm, that the blade was always the truest expression of power. Darth Vader's lightsaber stands as a testament to a lifetime of obsession, innovation, and unrelenting will. From the battlefields of the Clone Wars to the cold corridors of the Death Star, from the shadow of the Emperor's throne to the final moments with his son, the weapon remained the one constant in a life defined by conflict. Where others sought answers in prophecy or rituals, Vader placed his faith in the perfection of the blade, a weapon that could be refined, understood, and controlled. And in the end, that choice tells us everything we need to know about Anakin Skywalker and his transformation. For although he wore the mask of Vader, beneath it beat the heart of a warrior who believed that mastery, real mastery, was forged in the crucible of the duel. As always, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed this video chronicling all about Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber. And if you would like to see more videos like this, be sure to reach out with the Force and subscribe. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it. But regardless, have a phenomenal day.